we work on this exercise, but now let's look at the exercise closely. First, why do you think the income tax multiplier always has a negative sign in front of it? Okay. So whether it is an income tax cut or an income tax hike, income tax raise, it's the same thing. We have a negative sign in front of the income tax multiplier. So what does that mean? Why is that so? So some of you may have noticed that, well, that is because of the negative relationship between income tax and aggregate demand. Okay? So as income tax is lower, consumption increases, aggregate demand increases. When income tax is raised, consumption is lower, consequently aggregate demand is lower. So we always have this negative relationship between income tax and aggregate demand. So that's how we get a negative sign for the income tax multiplier. Another thing that we observe is that the size of the income tax multiplier is actually smaller than what we have for the government spending. So let's go back to the government spending. Previously, when we calculated the spending multiplier for government spending, that was 4. But with income tax multiplier, it is 3. Okay, so ignoring the negative sign, it is 3. So it is a smaller multiplier. Okay. Well, what that means is for the same amount of stimulus, so you see that it is the same amount of fiscal stimulus here, 100 billion income tax cut versus 100 billion increase in government spending. For the same amount of fiscal stimulus or fiscal constraint, income tax always has a smaller quantitative effect than government spending. Well, that is because income tax does not affect the aggregate demand directly. It affects the aggregate demand indirectly through consumption. Okay? So take, for example, this $100 billion. So if we consider an increase in government spending of $100 billion, so before the multiplier effect kicks in the very first round, the aggregate demand increases by $100 billion because government spending by itself is a component of aggregate demand. Okay? So that's the full effect on aggregate demand in the very first round. But that is not the case for income tax. So with an income tax cut of $100 billion lump sum amount, so household members get $100 billion extra income, so they will spend more. But they will not spend the entire $100 billion, not even in the first round. In the first round, so here we're given the marginal propensity to consume is 0.85. So in the very first round, even before the multiplier effect kicks in, the effect on the aggregate demand is already smaller. It's 85% of $100 billion, 85% of the stimulus. So it's 85 billion in the very first round before taking into consideration the multiplier effect. Then once you take into consideration the multiplier effect, obviously the effect is much smaller because each round you have 85% of the previous change in income and so on and so forth. So in sum, income tax always has a smaller effect than government spending. So here comes the question. So if income tax always has a smaller effect than the same amount of government spending, so why does the government bother to use Why does the government bother to use income tax as a policy tools at all? Why not just rely on government spending? Well, there is a couple of reasons for that. And first, it is philosophical. It is a small government versus big government. Okay? So personally, would you want the government, decide how much to spend, when to spend, what to spend on, and so on and so forth, right? Or you decide how much you want to spend, how you want to spend, when you want to spend, or whether you want to spend at all. So many of us would prefer the latter, right? So that means we would prefer income tax. So we don't want to give so much control over, how to spend the money in the hands of the government. So that's one of the reasons why income tax is also used as the policy tool sometimes. Another reason is that government spending is not easily reversible. So let's say the budget has been passed to build a new highway in New York City. So the economy is not doing so well. So the local government thinks that this is a good stimulus to stimulate local spending. But then when the project is somewhere in progress, the economy has turned around. Okay, so the economy is looking good, is looking up. So there is really no need for much stimulus anymore. But that time, there is no way to reverse the project. How are you going to reverse the project? If you stop the construction, it will be halfway done. It will be a waste. And then there's a lot of problems with constituents and so on and so forth. But with income tax, it is much more flexible. Okay? So if the economy is not doing so well, the government may think that we can stimulate the aggregate demand by cutting the income tax. But later on, when it turns around, when the economy turns around, the government can probably say that, well, why don't we raise the income tax? So that's easier to be done. Okay, so that's another reason why income tax can be used as a policy tool. Okay. So now let's go back to the last numerical example, transfer payment. So here, once again, we have a fiscal stimulus to stimulate the aggregate demand. So the transfer payment increases by $100 billion, and then we're given the marginal propensity to consume. We are given the marginal propensity to import. Okay. So we want to find the total effect on the aggregate demand. So very similar setup. The change in aggregate demand is equal to the change in transfer payment multiplied by the transfer payment multiplier. So once again, why don't you pause the video for a few minutes and then work on these examples.